I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
A display of North Korea's latest and most ambitious weapons, a backdrop for Kim Jong-un to mark the 76th anniversary of the Workers' Party and to rail on the United States.
To South Korea's military, which says Pyongyang has fired at least one ballistic missile from its east coast into the Sea of Japan. The missile was...
Last week, Kim Jong-un oversaw North Korea's largest military exhibition in recent years, and news just broke that North Korea tested submarine-launched ballistic missiles just hours after the U.S., South Korean, and Japanese envoys met in Washington. This latest display of the country's weapons comes at a time when the United States is pushing for North Korea to return to nuclear disarmament talks. But North Korea has failed to restart negotiations. As North Korea continues to grow their nuclear capabilities, how should the United States respond? Joining me today is Ankit Panda, the Stanton Senior Fellow at Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program. We'll unpack North Korea's growing arsenal of missiles and what U.S. policy toward North Korea should look like. Here we go. Ankit, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Doug. It's great to be here.
Well, we're glad always to have a colleague, so I appreciate you coming on. Let's get into it. News just broke as we're recording this that North Korea tested a submarine-launched ballistic missile just hours after U.S. and South Korean and Japanese envoys met in Washington to discuss Kim Jong-un and his regime. Tell us how this is playing. Was this a coincidence, a strategic provocation, and what may result from this test?
Well, thanks, Doug. We're still waiting to learn the precise details of what exactly the North Koreans tested. There's always a weird period of limbo when these tests are first reported versus when the North Koreans actually release the images and reports that allow us to analyze what was actually tested. But to answer your question, North Korea does tend to time these sorts of provocations to diplomatic events in the region occasionally. They've done this in recent years, but a lot of times, I think the overriding consideration for them when it comes to testing is whether it's a good time for them to test something, whether they'll derive technologically useful information to test, evaluate, and develop their new missile systems. Ultimately, as much as the outside world sees these as provocations for the North Koreans, the provocative aspect of these tests is really secondary to their primary technical value in improving their nuclear and missile capabilities more generally.
Let me ask you a question that we can step back a little bit. I've been watching the sort of dance that the U.S. does with North Korea for years. You've probably been watching it for decades. It feels like there's sort of a seesaw, with the exception of what happened with Trump, where we inch towards some sort of diplomacy and then they test a missile. I mean, is this kind of just like Groundhog Day with North Korea over and over again?
I think you're getting at something important, which is that for the North Koreans, another purpose when it comes to developing their nuclear capabilities and their missile capabilities is to seek leverage. And that leverage is important for them at the negotiating table. So, for instance, in 2018, when former President Donald Trump met with Kim Jong-un in Singapore, the North Koreans had just demonstrated months earlier the capability to range the entirety of the contiguous 48 United States. That was a new development. They'd never done that in the past. And it wasn't a coincidence that after demonstrating that capability, they turned to diplomacy. And so what I was writing and saying in 2017 when I was working on North Korea was that, look, these tests are bad, and the North Koreans are quickly demonstrating a range of important capabilities that they haven't demonstrated in the past. But a big reason they're doing it is because they're likely going to seek to talk to us soon. And they want to do that from as much of a position of strength as they can muster. And since the collapse of diplomacy, or the last round of diplomacy in 2019, the North Koreans have gone back to the drawing board. I think Kim Jong-un learned that the capabilities he demonstrated by the end of 2017 perhaps weren't sufficient for the United States to treat North Korea with respect as an equal, as a state that effectively deters the United States with nuclear weapons. And so now they're pushing ahead.
Let me ask a question about their tests. They continue to advance, and I do want to get back to the hypersonic missile in a second, but they continue to advance their capabilities. Submarine, multiple missile ICBMs, a couple of things you mentioned, hypersonic missiles. Is there ever a point of diminishing returns here for them in the sense that, like, okay, they can strike anywhere in the United States. Obviously, they would be annihilated in response. But, is there a point at which, like, their advancement sort of just stops being sort of a bigger and bigger threat to the United States? They've got this technology and it's here to stay.
So My view on that question is that absolutely, I think the North Koreans make a lot of decisions just from a managerial perspective that don't make a tremendous amount of sense to me. But of course, I'm an American analyst. I have a very different sense of what is a good expenditure for North Korea and its limited resources. And I think Kim Jong-un has a little bit of a different idea. And of course, here's where we get into domestic politics. And, people talk about North Korea as if it's a monolithic monarchy, and it is to an extent, but domestic politics exists in every country, including North Korea, and bureaucratic politics exist in North Korea as well. And I suspect Kim Jong-un finds himself being persuaded by many of his top engineers and scientists, many of whom want to test new capabilities, diverse capabilities. Just from a management perspective, right, you want to achieve economies of scale when it comes to building up a missile force. This is an intuitive idea that applies to not only building a nuclear deterrent, but also scaling up a company, for instance. And the North Koreans don't do this. They don't just focus on tried and tested missile designs and simply manufacture scores or hundreds of these systems. What we've been seeing under Kim Jong-un, and particularly in the last few years, is just an incredible diversity of missile systems in North Korea. In fact, the diversity of potential nuclear capable systems in North Korea today outclasses many other nuclear states, right? Certainly India and Pakistan, Israel, certainly France, the UK. The North Koreans just have a tremendous variety of systems, and it's not what you would expect to see in a country with the kind of resource constraints that they have.
Let's talk about hypersonics, because I know that is, all the rage in the world of nuclear policy, with multiple countries from Russia, China, and obviously North Korea working on hypersonic missiles. The North Korean one is called the Hwasong-8, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
So can you tell me, let's start at the basics. What really quick, what is different about a hypersonic weapon as compared to a regular ICBM?
Sure. So ballistic missiles, as their name implies, they travel a ballistic trajectory. Ballistic missiles will use a very large rocket booster, which actually will elevate, in the case of an ICBM, a nuclear warhead outside the Earth's atmosphere. And then if that warhead's going to Russia or China, in the case of a US ICBM, it would then use gravity. This whole process takes about 30 minutes, and then gravity would pull that missile down or pull that warhead down towards its target. The disadvantage for these kinds of missiles, especially for countries like Russia, China, North Korea, is that the United States has been building missile defenses that only work outside of the Earth's atmosphere against incoming reentry vehicles. So if you're a planner in Russia and China or North Korea, and you're worried about U.S. missile defenses that work outside the Earth's atmosphere, well, you have a few options. You can rely on exotic weapons, which the Russians have done to an extent. Or you can begin to fly your nuclear payloads much lower. You can begin to fly them inside the Earth's atmosphere. And this is where hypersonic gliders come in. So hypersonic gliders function by, they rely on a rocket booster to elevate the glider, which is at the top of the missile, to high altitudes, potentially outside the Earth's atmosphere or to the very top of the atmosphere. The glider then releases very quickly. And, in the case of a Chinese or Russian glider, this would happen not very far from their own territory. And then that glider would spend most of its flight path flying in the atmosphere, relying on a very high lift-to-drag ratio. It's an aerodynamic object. It's something like an aircraft, roughly speaking. It's not powered by any engines. It's simply relying on aerodynamic forces. And it glides to its eventual target, never getting to an altitude high enough where a U.S. missile defense system would be able to intercept it. So that's really the appeal of these weapons and why we've seen them crop up.
The way that these hypersonics fly, it's complicated. There have been advances recently that allow it to go at those speeds, at that height. Has North Korea successfully built a hypersonic missile, or is this sort of a bit more of posturing, and we're not really quite sure it works well?
So based on the first and only test of the Hwasong-8 in September 2021, my assessment is that the North Korean glider, at least, wasn't fully successful. And that's not very surprising. Developing gliders, as you suggested, is technologically complex. What they did do with this test, though, is they demonstrated, and they showed photographs of this glider, even at the exhibition that you mentioned at the start of the episode. And the glider looks a lot like pictures of what hypersonic weapons look like, right? So it's a convincing mock-up in many ways, but it's going to be a long, long time until the North Koreans are flying this glider with any degree of, I think, serious performance. But I think what's important about the glider is what it tells the outside world, which is that, don't expect the North Koreans to really shrink their ambitions. They're not, they're definitely punching above their weight here, right? A country with their resource constraints pursuing a hypersonic glider is something that I think a lot of people would not have expected a few years ago. But also that the North Koreans are seriously concerned about missile defenses. And it's not just the glider. There are other ways of defeating missile defenses, and the North Koreans have made investments there. One of the simplest ways to actually overwhelm missile defenses is just to build a lot of missiles, because missile defense systems are all going to be finite in their ability to deal with incoming missile threats. So the North Koreans are doing that. They're investing in cruise missiles, which also pose a threat for missile defenses. But I suspect that the hypersonic glider is really part of that broader story in North Korea.
So the hypersonic's not the only thing they're investing in, right? As you mentioned, they're kind of all hands to the pump here on all different types of technologies to try to increase their nuclear threat and their capability of potentially a strike, getting past our defenses. They just tested a new long-range cruise missile. Is that more capable of a missile that they've developed in their arsenal, and is it more of a threat than the hypersonic program they currently have?
What's new about this cruise missile is two things. So the older cruise missiles that North Korea had ranges in the low hundreds of kilometers. This new cruise missile, the North Koreans claim, has a range of around 1,500 kilometers. So it's an order of magnitude improvement in that regard. And it puts this missile in the same class as newer U.S. Tomahawk cruise missiles or Russian Caliber cruise missiles, much longer range systems. And the other thing that's new about this cruise missile is that the North Koreans claimed that it was a, quote, strategic weapon. And that phrase, strategic weapon, is a euphemism that very commonly appears in North Korean state media reports, usually to suggest a nuclear delivery role. So this would be their first nuclear-capable cruise missile as well, although there are a few questions about whether the North Koreans have actually developed a nuclear warhead small enough and light enough to fit on a cruise missile. They've certainly done that for ballistic missiles, but there are a few special challenges associated with shrinking a warhead down to be fitted on a cruise missile.
So I want to take a step back for a second, because North Korea is simultaneously a huge threat, not only to the United States, to South Korea, Japan, potentially. They're also an incredibly poor country, sealed off as much as anyone can be from the rest of the world. So I want to just ask you, how is it that such a country can have such a advanced and aggressive, technologically capable nuclear program despite these challenges? I mean, what do you attribute that to? How did they get there?
I should begin by saying that our sources of information into the size of North Korea's economy, the total level of expenditure on their nuclear and missile forces is really rather imprecise. The North Koreans don't release economic data. They are a Marxist-Leninist command economy, which means that it's very difficult to price things like labor, right? It's very easy to understand what the labor costs are, for instance, for the U.S. military-industrial complex, where we know that having highly trained scientists and engineers with many years of education is not going to be cheap. In the North Korean case, we just don't know. I think what the North Korean case, however, demonstrates is that when you have a sovereign nation state with the resources of a sovereign nation state, even if those resources aren't necessarily on the level of a major power, that makes it an absolute national strategic priority to pursue, develop, and refine a nuclear force. It will succeed. And I think that's really been the story of the North Korean nuclear program, especially over the last 20 years or so, when we've tried to make increasing attempts to actually constrain their capability to get what they need from overseas: cash, parts, expertise.
After the break, I'll ask Ankit about U.S. policy toward Kim Jong-un's regime and what options the Biden administration has to contain a nuclear North Korea. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
North Korea's aggressive young dictator is back to tweaking, agitating, clamoring for the West's attention, and getting it. North Korea's news agency claims Kim Jong-un's military has test-fired a hypersonic missile, which can travel...
The U.S. envoy to North Korea, Sung Kim, has reiterated that the United States is open to meeting North Korea without preconditions. And this was the reaction.
All right, so I want to talk about the Biden administration and really all U.S. administrations and their strategies on North Korea. But before we jump into that, can you just remind us who the big players are sort of in this U.S.-North Korea relationship? Because it's not just those two nations.
Right. So I think a very important consideration for the United States is our two allies in the region, Japan and South Korea. We have separate alliances with each of them, and it just so happens that Tokyo and Seoul actually have very different preferences for what they would like to see happen with North Korea, and that's a very important complicating factor. The two other important players in the region historically, insofar as diplomacy with North Korea is concerned, are Russia and China. And their relationships with North Korea are complex. I think a pervasive misunderstanding in the U.S. policy discussion around North Korea is the idea that North Korea somehow takes its marching orders from Beijing. That could not be further from the truth. The North Koreans, I think, above all, favor their own autonomy, their strategic autonomy. They do, however, recognize that 90% of their overseas trade is with China and that China is a valuable economic partner. But the North Korea and China relationship has gone through rocky periods. It was not very good, for instance, between 2013 and early 2018, for instance. So that's something I think that's always worth reminding folks, that China and North Korea, even though they are perceived to be sort of unwavering allies, do have a complex relationship between them. But it's really those four countries, apart from the U.S. and North Korea, that we're talking about when we're talking about diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula surrounding denuclearization.
All right, so let's talk about the Biden administration. And I just have to say, as someone who watches foreign policy day in and day out, North Korea has not come up a lot because the Biden folks have been focused elsewhere, Afghanistan, plenty of different things going on. And then you contrast that to Trump, who was like offering to build condos on North Korean beaches and, having these unprecedented meetings with Kim Jong-un. So even though it looks sort of different from that perspective, I'm curious how much different the Biden administration's policy towards Kim Jong-un and North Korea is from President Trump's.
So, there is obviously, I think, an important difference in the form that diplomacy is going to take with North Korea if and when it resumes under the Biden administration. For instance, I think President Biden, even as a candidate, even as president-elect, was quite clear that he didn't support the idea of meeting directly with Kim Jong-un himself. And that was obviously, I think, the big innovation that the last administration introduced to U.S. diplomacy with North Korea. But the broad contours of U.S.-North Korea policy have really remained unchanged for the last 30 years, especially in terms of how we think about our leverage to bring the North Koreans to the negotiating table. So what the North Koreans want here, I think, is important to understand. The North Koreans want really two things. They want relief from economic sanctions, and they want to be treated as an equal by the United States. And when I say equal, I don't literally mean that the North Koreans expect to be elevated as a new superpower on the world stage, but they expect the United States to treat North Korea as the U.S. would any other nuclear-armed adversary. Meanwhile, here in Washington, I don't think you have to look too far to find people that are very uncomfortable with the idea of treating North Korea as an equal in a diplomatic process. So unfortunately, I think a lot of things have been held back by that inability in the United States to really think through what it means now that North Korea has these capabilities. When it comes to the Biden administration's policy, I think one of the positive developments has been the way in which they've talked about denuclearization. The United States has now started under the Biden administration talking about denuclearization as a long-term objective. And I think that's a positive step. It's a realistic step. It shows the North Koreans that probably when we get back to the negotiating table, we're not going to ask them for the keys to their nuclear kingdom, which is really what the Trump administration was asking for, and part of the reason why Kim was unwilling to do business after the Hanoi summit, for instance, in February 2019. And so that's a positive development. Where I think the administration has more thinking to do is on the issue of what we are willing to offer the North Koreans. So, at the beginning of this episode, you mentioned Kim Jong-un's speech at the exhibition. In that speech, he explained why he hasn't been picking up the phone when the United States has been calling. The U.S. has had, I think, a particularly open-minded approach to talks with North Korea. Sung Kim, the special representative for the Biden administration, has repeatedly said that he's willing to meet his North Korean counterpart anywhere, anytime, without preconditions to discuss anything. And that's pretty much as open-minded as you can be. The North Koreans don't want an open-minded offer. They want the administration to put something concrete on the table, and that's what they've been looking for years now.
So I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. leverage, because it seems to me that they don't really have much. And the reason for that is because we've basically sanctioned North Korea to the maximum point where sanctions could realistically go, even to the point where, there are maybe humanitarian arguments against some of them. So, I mean, short of giving the North Koreans what they want, does the U.S. have a lot of points of leverage here?
So the U.S., I think, has more limited leverage than we think we do. Our policy is designed around the notion that we have significant leverage and that the North Koreans recognize that, and they want us to relieve the pressure that we're applying on them. Our policy is based on the premise of trying to coerce North Korea or compel North Korea into making a different strategic decision for its own national defense. And that strategic decision concerns the value of nuclear weapons. We want them to suggest that or come to the realization that nuclear weapons are going to have more costs over the long run than benefits for North Korea. And economic sanctions have been a big part of this toolkit. The sanctions hurt. There's no denying that the sanctions hurt North Korea's economy. The sanctions on luxury goods make it a little bit more difficult for Kim Jong-un and his cronies to live the kind of life that they want. They have a harder time importing skis and fine wines and whiskeys from Europe, for instance. But they do eventually get there. But what sanctions absolutely don't do, or at least there's no evidence that I can see, and if you even read the U.S. intelligence community's worldwide threat assessments for the last few years, the entire IC also agrees with this, is that sanctions are not really pushing Kim Jong-un's hand when it comes to his nuclear weapons. And I think the reason for that is rather intuitive, right? So why does North Korea have nuclear weapons? North Korea has nuclear weapons because they think nuclear weapons are going to help them survive a potential attack by the United States and South Korea. And if you're Kim Jong-un, what price do you put on your own survival? Effectively, I think the way to understand what price a leader puts on his or her own survival is effectively that the benefits of continued survival are infinite because you live longer, you can realize more possibilities. Whereas the benefits of sanctions relief, as large as they might be, are inherently going to be finite. They are going to have a practical dollar value in terms of what your economy can achieve in the next few years. And so I think that's the assessment that Kim Jong-un makes, that the benefits he perceives to derive from his own nuclear weapons are vast, infinite, unbounded, and something that can't have a price put on it, whereas the benefits that he perceives to gain in the case of sanctions relief are finite.
All right, I want to end with a couple quick questions. But first, you recently wrote a piece, which we'll link in the show notes, on the lessons that the U.S. can draw from the Iran deal as they negotiate with North Korea. Can you just briefly talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. So that report was mostly in the context of what we can learn in terms of verifying North Korean disarmament, because that's been a huge challenge historically. The North Koreans are hostile to the notion of verification itself. They view it as tantamount to espionage. But for the United States, the international community, verification is really, you cannot do without verification. Any deal to reduce the threat from North Korea, to cap its capabilities, absolutely needs to be verified. To be politically saleable, first of all, in national capitals, in Beijing and Washington, certainly with Congress here in the United States, but also to be practically useful. So that paper, which I co-wrote with my Carnegie colleague Toby Dalton, looked at the verification innovations that were presented in the course of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, more colloquially known as the Iran deal. Some of those concern new authorities for the International Atomic Energy Agency. But, I should probably also state that there are significant differences between the Iran and North Korea cases. The biggest one being that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon today, isn't known to be seeking a nuclear weapon today, although it may do so in the future. North Korea, as we've discussed, is an incredibly capable nuclear state with ICBMs, thermonuclear weapons, really the whole enchilada. And then turning back to Iran, Iran also has a very different relationship with the international nonproliferation regime. It is part of the Nonproliferation Treaty, which North Korea pulled out of in 2003. And as a result of its participation in the NPT, Iran has a safeguards agreement with the IAEA. And of course, as a result of the 2015 agreement, Iran has a lot of special provisions applied, including a provisional additional protocol, which enhances verification, access, and measures. So what we were trying to look at in our paper is what can negotiators learn from that experience that might be applied to a future talk with North Korea. There are provisions in the JCPOA, for instance, on short notice access to sites, on prescribing exports and controlling the imports of potential prescribed capabilities of concern. So we take a look at how these might be brought over into the North Korean case. There isn't a direct mapping, of course, but we do think some of those ideas and innovations can have value in a process with North Korea.
All right, Ankit, I'm going to get you out of here with one more question. Our colleague Toby Dalton, who was the co-author on the paper you just mentioned, is working on a piece which I've read in which he says we're stuck in the same cycle over and over again. We negotiate with the North Koreans, or we talk about it. They fire some new missiles or reveal some new technology. South Korea remains unsafe, as does Japan. China remains caught in the middle. And this cycle just perpetuates over and over again because the policy and the policy perspective of the United States does not change. So President Biden calls you up and he says, Ankit, I really want to fix this. What do I do?
Sure. So, as a good faith advisor to the president, I would, I think, tell the president what I just told you, which is that the U.S. fundamentally needs to be ready to put something on the table that the North Koreans want. It's not a controversial or complex idea that diplomacy tends to succeed when each side takes the other side's interests seriously and bases policy off of that premise. We haven't really done that with the North Koreans. And I think that was true even when the Trump administration was offering to build condos for Kim-Jong-un on the beaches of North Korea. That's not what the North Koreans wanted. They would, in fact, view, economic integration with the outside world as a threat to their regime because integration allows for ideas, blue jeans and McDonald's to flow into the country, which would be a disaster for the North Korean regime and its interest in keeping a very close level of control on what its population does. But on one hand, I would also tell the president, look, the odds of successfully engaging North Korea are not very high in the short term, even if we do all of the right things, because ultimately, I think right now the North Koreans are in an introspective state. Part of that is because of the pandemic. Diplomatic missions have been shutting down in Pyongyang more broadly. North Korea is retreating into its shell. It is isolating itself in many ways. So they might not even reciprocate any U.S. overtures at this point. And there's nothing you can do about that. If the other side is not willing to talk, even when you're saying the exact right things, your options are very limited. The best you can hope for is managing any crisis. And that sort of brings me to the broader point here, which is that traditionally speaking, North Korea has not been where American presidents go looking for a foreign policy win, with the exception of the last president, who had a foreign policy win, at least in appearances, at the Singapore summit, until it all collapsed. And so on one level, North Korea today is a problem to be managed. It's not a problem to be solved. And I think that's going to form if you asked me what I think is actually going to happen versus what I think should happen, I would probably expect that successive administrations will seek to manage this problem. They'll seek to ensure that the North Koreans don't undertake any kind of coercive action against South Korea or begin using their nuclear shield as an opportunity to cause havoc in the region. But as long as they keep their heads down, I think the U.S. will really try to keep the lid on this and ensure that it doesn't spin out of control. And I think that's just the unfortunate reality of where we've gotten to with the North Korean problem today.
Ankit, thank you so much for coming on the show. And for all of those listeners, please go follow Ankit at NKTPND on Twitter and come to the Carnegie Endowment website and see all of Ankit's research and content on North Korea. It's an ongoing issue. Seems like it'll be going on forever. And Ankit will keep us all informed on all the new developments.
Thanks a lot for having me, Doug. This was a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrar. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.